Several years ago, Phoebe and I updated our wills. We'd first written wills when the children were small. We felt it was necessary if we had dependents. And our catalyst for renewing them several years back was that the kids were now on the cusp of adulthood. And so we had a new set of instructions. So off we went and found a lawyer. We reckoned this work was important to make sure we were taking care of our kids as best we can. When we die, we reckoned it was important to remember the places that are important to us. Our wills say that some of our money goes to Grace Memorial when we die. Maybe your will says something similar. And we reckoned it was important to minimize the hassle for the people who survive us. For the same reason, it's good to have a funeral plan. It's nice to not leave the people who love you and are mourning you wondering what is next. So off we went we found this lawyer, and if you've done this ritual, you're familiar with the reams of paper and signing and legal language, a lot of which is beyond my comprehension. And it wouldn't really stick in my mind, except as we were heading out the door with this massive binder of legal documents and a thumb drive. The lawyer called after us. She said, "Congratulations on your new wills. I hope you never need them." So, spoiler alert, we will need the wills. That is a thing that is going to happen. We are going to die. I think this sticks in my mind, this experience, because there's something deeply human about it, or maybe deeply modernly human. I don't know how the ancients understood reality, if they had a different relationship with death. I suspect they did than we do. But certainly in our culture, there is this really pervasive story we tell ourselves that if we just made the right moves, death would be an avoidable misfortune. And I think that is why so often when somebody dies, we're asking questions like, how old were they? And did they smoke? And were they drinking? Or did they drive a motorcycle too fast? We're looking for reasons that their mortality is not a comment on our mortality. We're looking for reasons to be excused from death coming knocking. Here in the church, we do something subversive. If that's kind of the norm in our society, to imagine that you might not need a will, we do something subversive, which is regularly across the church year. We talk about death, and we talk about our own deaths. We just kept the Feast of All Souls and All Saints, where we remember everybody who has died, whom we love. On Good Friday, we name that death exists, that the cross exists even for Jesus. On Ash Wednesday, we say, don't forget you're going to die. Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Radical words in a death-denying culture. And I'm thinking about all of this today because it is the Feast of Christ the King. Christ the King being the feast day that ends the church year. Next week will be Advent, the first Sunday of Advent. Can you believe it? How did that happen? Christ the King is a relatively recent feast day. A lot of the feasts we keep are super ancient in nature. And Christ the King is created in 1925 in response to the rise of Mussolini and his cronies. There's this sense in the church that human beings were, and including church members, were trying to make someone or something into king that wasn't God. That human beings were thinking about worshiping something that wasn't God. And so this is a feast day that says, don't forget, Christ alone is king. In other words, when this building was opened that we're in right now in 1926, when this building was brand new, the Feast of Christ the King was also brand new. It was 1 year old at that point. The building opens in 1926. The feast is from 1925. And so this building opens with the church saying to itself, don't forget. Don't forget that God alone is God. As a woman of blessed memory would say to me, be careful what you worship because you will worship something. That feels like an important reminder. And the reason I'm talking about finitude, the reason I'm talking about mortality, about the reality that you and I will die on this day, is it seems to me that if we succumb to the cultural story that death is avoidable, then it becomes easier to worship stuff that isn't God. It becomes easier to make things into king that are not God. Because if we're here just for a while, if this life is a fleeting gift, if we're sojourners on this earth, then it's a lot clearer that that we're stewards for a while of our gift, of our money, of our stuff, of what have you, but we don't really own them. C.S. Lewis said there are few things more dangerous a human being can say than "I have a place in the world." And when we utter such a thing, when we say, well, I'm here effectively forever, all sorts of things can become king that are not Christ. Stuff would be example. Think about the religion that is consumerism, that says if we just accumulate the right things and enough things, we will achieve salvation. We'll be lovable and young and on beaches, running around having this marvelous time. That's the promise of every beer commercial ever, right? Sometimes we identify a political party as something like king. I just heard sociologists, I've never heard this term before, refer to the term partyism. Partyism being elevating a given party, a given political leader, see Mussolini, to the status of something like a religious figure. And there is clearly an orthodox way of voting, and to fail to vote in that way is to engage in heresy. Right? We've made something into king that isn't God here. To imagine we're here forever is to risk making money into king, making cash into something we worship. I will achieve salvation if I finally have enough of it. In addition to being the Feast of Christ the King, this is a day in which we have multiple notable things happening. There are, I'm told, I said in the Grace Notes there's a notable birthday today, but apparently there's actually multiple notable birthdays today. Looking forward to hearing about that come the Thanksgivings and anniversaries. This is a day on which we are honoring the Reverend Stephen Schneider for his 20 years at Grace Memorial. Stephen, thank you for being here. Today's the 10th anniversary of Father Stephen's retirement. His final day was on Christ the King, and it is the day on which we are, you and I, are invited to bring our pledge cards to the altar, our statements of our intention to support Grace financially in 2025 and to ask God's blessing upon them. It wasn't by design that all this stuff ended up on the same day. We had a sort of series of independent conversations that all of which said, you know, that would be a good day on which to do this thing. But I'm kind of delighted with the confluence of these different holy rivers on this day. It seems to me that that Father Stephen's ministry here at Grace was defined in many ways by recognizing that he and this community together didn't have forever, that we were not here permanently, and that we got the privilege of being stewards for a while, that he and you, I was not here, got the privilege of being stewards for a while of this good place called Grace Memorial, and that as a consequence, the community was called to recognize Christ as King, not something else or someone else, and to wonder what that meant. What would it mean to live in a way that was congruent with the great commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. The second commandment, it's the same as the first, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. And Father Stephen tells this extraordinary story of walking through the wrought iron gates and noticing that the sign there said not Grace Memorial Episcopal Church, which you might expect it to say. That would be a reasonable thing for the gate to say. But instead said Grace Memorial Parish. Parish being this old school word that means something like neighborhood or community. So right written on the gate is this sense that to say yes to Christ as King is to turn outward. And the 20 years of ministry which this community shared with Father Stephen saw this deliberate and intense outward turning. It is during this time that Hill McMahon and friends begin the Friday feed, which becomes the Friday feast, and now is the Sunday dinner. It is the time when the partnership with Fame begins, Fame that does work with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, begins a partnership that continues today. It is the time when, in many ways, what Grace's signature ministry is. Grace Art Camp begins at that point. A extraordinary ministry that has grown and grown, so much so that if you mention Grace to someone today, odds are very good they will say to you, "Oh, my kids went to Grace Art Camp," or "My grandchildren went to Grace Art Camp." There's this deliberate turning outwards and serving of the neighborhood. This is the time when the seed is planted to renovate the chapel, a thing that we completed last year, and that has allowed that space to serve the community so much more deeply than it was previously. I recently did a quick and dirty building use audit of Grace, which is to say I looked at the calendar and dumped what I saw into a spreadsheet because I was curious how much of the use of this building is for religious purposes. I'm doing air quotes there because there's an entire second sermon on what we mean by the word religious. But for the purposes of our conversation this morning, I'm going to use the word religious to mean stuff like this, being together in church. And what I found was the legacy of the work that this community and Father Stephen did together reflected in this calendar. 10% of the calendar is used by religious purposes. The other 90% of this building is used by things like Art Camp, by Fame, by 12-step groups, folks finding sobriety and sanity and stability in their lives, by Taekwondo, children developing confidence and competence, by concerts, by community groups, by book groups, you name it. All of these people gathering in this place to find healing, belonging, and meaning. For the first time, did I tell you this a couple of weeks ago? I can't remember if I shared this already. For the first time during our lengthy partnership with Northwest Housing Alternatives, where we've been working towards building affordable housing in the parking lot, for the first time, NHA's guess was the project would start in under 2 years. That's still crystal ball stuff, right? But always the estimate in the past was it was more than 2 years out. And suddenly we're talking about a scenario in which in the second quarter of 2026, we might see an excavator here. There's no question that this community was able to get to yes, to say we should serve God and neighbor. We should declare Christ as King via building affordable housing because of the outward turning work that took place that y'all did together with Father Stephen over the 20 years of his ministry here. There's something exciting in this place. There is good work happening in this place, and what a gift to get to be part of it. What a gift to be stewards of it for a while. So as many of you know, I run the complaint department at Grace. And a variety of subjects show up. Some things I expect to hear complaints about, and others catch me off guard. And one of the things that I have been surprised to receive complaints about is a thing that I talk out loud about, is the practice of the tithe. Phoebe and I are tithers. The tithe is the biblical practice of giving away 10% of your income to support the work of the kingdom. We became tithers, I don't know, in the last 7 or 8 years. We had discerned this call to give in this way, and we didn't know if we could. It seemed like a big stretch to get up to 10%, but we felt this draw, this call to it, and so we made a push, and over a number of years. Dick Toll talked about this last week, didn't he? We found our way to a place where we were able to tithe, and friends, the tithe has become one of our family's most rewarding spiritual practices. I wouldn't go back to before. It is so good to be able to look at our finances and say that our giving is deeply congruent with our values. It is good to kind of release our hold on our money. The tithe is a way of saying that our money doesn't own us. I wondered if, when we made this commitment to giving with 10% as our rule, if I would become more anxious about money. That's a big line item to add to your budget. And I think I might actually be less anxious about money than I was before. There's something freeing about this practice. And it's a good feeling to know that when the ministries that some of the ministries that I was naming take place at Grace, that we had a hand in making those possible. It's wonderful to know that we had a small part in making Art Camp possible. We had a small part in making this assembly possible, and the wonderful music and other things that happen here possible. It's wonderful to know that this is a place of transformation, of healing, belonging, and meaning for the neighborhood. Busy 7 days a week. What a wonderful coincidence, Sue, that we got to hear that song, 7 whole days, not 1 in 7. This is a building that is busy 7 days a week. I've never entirely figured out why talking about the tithe is something that I get heat for. My hunch, looking kind of into my own heart, is that the reason our family resisted becoming tithers, I think, was that it is a practice that requires a kind of self-examination that we didn't necessarily want to do. Prior to being tithers, we said, I can't afford to give that much money to the church. I can't afford to give that much money to other causes that I support. And as I started to look carefully at my finances, I realized that a morally accurate statement was not I can't afford it, but I prefer to spend the money on Netflix and coffee rather than giving the money away. And that's fine, by the way. I want to be very clear about this. You are allowed to prefer to spend money on Netflix or coffee or whatever you like. That's not wrong. But what I discerned for myself was it was healthiest to name that out loud and say that's a choice, not something somebody is making me do. And once it was framed in the language of choice, that changed things for me. There was some freedom in that. So here's the hard news. You're going to need your wills. And here's the good news. You're going to need your wills. And may that be freeing. May the gift of recognizing that we're here just for a while, that we have a sojourn on this earth, that finitude is real, and then one day we've come from God and we're going to return to God. may that invite us to live with freedom and urgency. May we decide that all the stuff that the world invites us to make into king, that none of those things, none of those people were ever kings at all. Christ alone is king. That is good news and wondrous news. And if we say yes to that, to the stewardship that invites us into, that means we get to be part of the extraordinary work of joining with Christ for the time that we are on this earth, of being stewards of this holy work, and together inviting the kingdom near.